The old man's hands were a map of his life's work. Each line a story, each callus a memory of a perfectly carved curve or a stubborn piece of wood that finally gave way. At 65, his name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in concert halls from Vienna to New York. He was a master, a creator of instruments that sang with the voices of angels. His workshop was his sanctuary, a sun-drenched room filled with the scent of aged spruce, sweet maple, and the faint, sharp tongue of varnish. Every tool had its place, hung on shadowed pegboards or nestled in felt-lined drawers. It was a kingdom of order, built on a foundation of unyielding discipline and a lifetime of secrets. He was in the middle of planing the back of a cello, his body moving in a slow, rhythmic dance. The sharp blade of the plane glided across the wood, shaving off a curl so thin you could see the light through it. It was a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat, a soft, whispery she that was the sound of perfection being born. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear the hesitant creak of the workshop door opening. It was the faint, almost apologetic cough that finally broke his concentration. He stopped. The plane held midair and turned. A young woman stood in the doorway, clutching a worn canvas bag to her chest like a shield. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her clothes were simple, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked small and out of place amidst the grandeur of his workshop, like a wildflower that had accidentally sprouted in a perfectly manicured garden. He had agreed to take her on as an apprentice, a favor to an old colleague who had insisted she had a feel for the wood. So far, the old man had seen no evidence of it. "You're late," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. He didn't mean to sound harsh, but impatience was a habit he had never bothered to break. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes darting around the room, taking in everything. "The bus?" He waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off. Excuses were like sawdust, they got everywhere and were ultimately useless. "There is a piece of maple on the bench by the window. And some sandpaper. Your job for today is to learn what smooth feels like." He pointed with his chin. "Go." The young woman nodded quickly and scurried over to the bench. The old man watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw her pick up the piece of wood, her hands uncertain. He saw her look at the sandpaper, then back at the wood, as if she'd never seen either before. He let out a small, weary sigh. This was going to be a long, tiring chore. He had built his legacy on precision, on a deep, almost spiritual understanding of his materials. This girl, she just seemed lost. He turned back to his own work, trying to recapture the rhythm he had lost. But his ears were still tuned to her. He could hear the harsh, scratchy sound of her sanding. It was all wrong. It was the sound of aggression, of a fight. He winced. "Not like you're scrubbing a floor." He called out without turning around. "You are caressing it? You are trying to reveal the soul that is already inside. You must feel the grain. Let your fingers tell you where to go." The scratching stopped for a moment. Then it started again, a little softer this time, but still clumsy. He could picture her, her arm moving stiffly, her shoulders hunched with tension. She was trying to follow his instructions, he could tell, but her body wasn't listening. She was thinking too much. Wood, he often said, doesn't respond to thoughts. It responds to touch? He put his own plane down and picked up a delicate carving knife, beginning to shape the scroll of the cello's neck. This was the part that required the most artistry, the part that gave the instrument its unique personality. His hands moved with an economy of motion that came from 50 years of practice. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. As he worked, his mind drifted. He remembered his own master, a severe, silent man who had taught him with sharp raps on the knuckles and grunted approval that was rarer than gold. He had been terrified of him. But he had learned. He had learned that there was only one way to do things, the right way. His way, this girl, with her soft voice and uncertain hands, represented everything he feared. A new generation that wanted quick results, that didn't understand the value of struggle and repetition. He felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but it was quickly swallowed by a wave of protectiveness. This craft, his life's work, was a sacred flame. He would not let it be dimmed by clumsy, uncaring hands. After an hour, he could stand the sound no longer. He put his knife down and walked over to her bench. The piece of maple in her hands was a mess. She had created uneven patches, some spots still rough, others sanded too far, ruining the perfect surface. He took it from her, his face a stony mask. He ran his own callous thumb over the wood. It felt like a road full of potholes. "You see?" he said, holding it up. He didn't shout. His disappointment was a much heavier weight than anger could ever be. "This is not smooth. This is damaged. You have not worked with the wood. You have assaulted it." The young woman's face fell. Her eyes, which had been so busy observing everything, now fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," she said again, the words barely audible. "I'm trying." "Trying is not enough," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. He picked up a fresh sheet of sandpaper. "Watch." He held the wood at a specific angle, his fingers splayed across its surface. He began to move, his whole arm flowing from the shoulder. The sound was completely different now, a gentle, even hush that was almost musical. "You don't press. You let the weight of your arm do the work. You follow the grain. It is like petting a cat. You don't go against the fur." He demonstrated for a few more minutes, then handed the wood and the sandpaper back to her. Again, she took it, her fingers brushing against his. For a brief moment, he felt a strange stillness in her touch, a calm that contradicted her nervous appearance. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She took a deep breath and tried to mimic his movements. It was better, but still far from good. The old man felt a familiar weariness settle over him. This was going to take more time than he had. He was a master craftsman, not a miracle worker. He decided to give her a different task, something simpler. "Here," he said, picking up a small, beautifully shaped block of wood that would one day become the chin rest for a violin. "Use the scraper. Just take off the very top layer, gently." He showed her the tool, a flat piece of steel with a sharp, hooked edge. He demonstrated how to draw it towards her, creating a fine, powdery dust. It was a test of pure control. He went back to his own bench, his mind already moving on to the complex problem of fitting the bass bar. He could hear her behind him, the light, scraping sound of the tool. It was hesitant at first, then a little more confident. He allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Maybe she wasn't a lost cause after all. Maybe she just needed to be shown everything 100 times. He was so focused on measuring the exact placement for the bass bar that he didn't hear the scraping stop. He glanced over at his workbench, at a polished metal plate he used for checking the straightness of his tools. And in its reflection he saw her. She was standing perfectly still, the scraper held loosely in one hand. Her other hand was hovering just above the surface of the small wooden block. She wasn't touching it. Her eyes were closed. Her face, usually a mask of uncertainty and apology, was now serene. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she were listening to a distant, beautiful melody. Her hand moved slowly, an inch above the wood, tracing its shape. It wasn't the movement of a beginner. It was the movement of an expert, of someone who was reading the wood like a book, feeling its history, its density, its hidden strengths and weaknesses in a way that had nothing to do with sight. It lasted for no more than 5 seconds. Then, as if she felt his eyes on her, her expression changed. The mask snapped back into place. Her eyes opened, wide and uncertain again. She gave a little shudder, as if waking from a dream, and went back to scraping. The sound once again becoming hesitant and clumsy. The old man stared, his heart thumping strangely in his chest. He turned away quickly, his mind racing. What had he just seen? Was he imagining things? He shook his head, trying to clear the image. It was probably nothing. A trick of the light, a moment of daydreaming? She was just a tired girl struggling to keep up. He was the master. He knew what he was seeing. He had to, but as he picked up his knife to resume his work, he found his hands were not quite as steady as they had been before. And for the rest of the afternoon, every time he heard a hesitant scrape or a clumsy shuffle from her side of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who was truly lost. The seasons turned in the window of the workshop. The bright green leaves of summer gave way to the fiery red and gold of autumn, and then to the bare, skeletal branches of winter. Inside, the air remained the same, a constant perfume of wood and resin. The young woman became a fixture, a quiet shadow in the corner of the old man's kingdom. She learned his routines, his habits, his unspoken rules. She learned to sharpen his chisels until they could shave a hair, to mix his varnish to the exact shade of honey he preferred, and to sweep the floor at the end of the day with a series of precise, methodical strokes. She became proficient, a perfect copy of his technique. When he told her to sand a piece of wood, her movements were now smooth and even. When he showed her how to carve a scroll, she could replicate the shape with impressive accuracy. He should have been proud. He had taught her well. And yet, a strange unease had settled over him since that day he had seen her with her eyes closed. He found himself watching her more closely, not with the critical eye of a master, but with the quiet suspicion of a detective. He'd catch her doing things differently. Small things? He'd tell her to use a ruler to measure the placement of a violin's F holes, but he'd see her hold the tool in place, close her eyes for just a second, and then mark the spot with a pencil. When he'd check her measurement with his own ruler, it would be perfect, down to the fraction of a millimeter. Beginner's luck, he'd grumble, but the words tasted hollow. Another time, a tiny crack appeared on the edge of a mandolin she was finishing. He was about to throw the piece away, but she stopped him. She mixed a tiny bit of glue with some fine dust from the same piece of wood, creating a putty that was an exact color match. She filled the crack so expertly that when it dried, even he, with his magnifying glass, couldn't find the seam. When he asked her where she learned that, she just shrugged and said, "It just seemed like the right thing to do." Her methods were unorthodox, intuitive, and they drove him crazy. They were a quiet, constant challenge to the rigid, logical world he had built his life upon. The real trouble began on a cold Tuesday in November. A letter arrived, thick with expensive paper and bearing the crest of a famous European orchestra. It was a commission, the kind of luthier dreams of. A world-renowned cellist, a man whose name was known in every classical music household, wanted a new cello. Not just any cello. He wanted it made from a specific, legendary piece of wood the old man had acquired years ago, a breathtaking piece of flamed maple that shimmered like a tiger's eye when it caught the light. The old man had been saving it, waiting for the perfect instrument, the culmination of his life's work. This was it. The pressure was immense, a heavy weight that settled on his shoulders the moment he read the letter. He brought the precious wood down from its special storage rack and laid it on his main workbench. He ran his hands over its surface, feeling the energy vibrating within it. He explained its history to the young woman, his voice filled with a reverence he usually reserved for prayer. "This," he said, his eyes gleaming, "this will be my masterpiece." But when he tried to begin, the magic was gone. The wood that had once felt alive now felt dead and unresponsive in his hands. He spent a week just sketching the design for the cello's back. He drew curve after curve, but they were all wrong. They were stiff, lifeless, technical. They lacked the soul, the effortless grace that was the signature of his best work. He became frustrated, then angry. The peaceful atmosphere of the workshop curdled. He snapped at the young woman for the slightest noise. He threw away perfectly good pieces of wood for tiny imperfections no one else would ever see. He wasn't sleeping. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with the image of those dead, useless curves burned into his mind. The young woman watched him from her corner. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands, once so steady, now had a slight tremor. She saw the magnificent piece of maple on his bench, looking sad and neglected, its beautiful flame pattern hidden under a light layer of dust. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. Every time she offered to take on a task to lighten his load, he would wave her away with a sharp, angry gesture. He was an island, and he was determined to drown in his own frustration. Weeks turned into a month. The deadline for the cello was looming, and he had barely begun. Finally, in a desperate burst of inspiration, or what he hoped was inspiration, he settled on a design. It wasn't his best, but it would have to do. He began to carve the arching of the cello's back, the gradual, sloping curve that gives the instrument its power and resonance. He worked with a feverish intensity, his body tense, his jaw clenched. He was fighting the wood, forcing it to bend to his will. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The shape was emerging, and it wasn't terrible. He grew bolder, more confident. He decided to take one final, slightly deeper cut to perfect the curve. It was a greedy cut, a cut made from impatience rather than skill. There was a sickening, loud crack that echoed through the silent workshop. The old man froze, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He looked down. A deep, ugly gouge ran across the most prominent part of the back. It was too deep to fill, too large to carve out. The magnificent piece of wood, the wood meant for his masterpiece, was ruined, all the frustration. The sleepless nights, the crushing pressure, and the deep-seated fear of failure erupted out of him in a single, primal roar. He ripped the carving gouge from his hand and hurled it across the room. It hit the far wall with a deafening clang and clattered to the floor. He stood there, breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists, staring at the ruined wood as if it had personally betrayed him. "Get out!" He screamed at the young woman, who was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. His voice was raw, cracking with despair. "Just get out." She didn't move for a second, her face pale. Then she quietly put down her tools, took her bag, and slipped out the door. Closing it softly behind her, the old man was alone. He sank onto his stool, his head in his hands. The weight of his failure was crushing. He, the master, had destroyed his own masterpiece with his own arrogance. He had followed all his rules, all his perfect methods, and it had led him to this moment of total ruin. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in the darkness of his own making. Finally, with a heavy sigh that seemed to drain the last of his life from him, he stood up, walked out of the workshop, and locked the door behind him, leaving the light on and the ruined cello back weeping on the bench. The silence that followed her words was deeper and more profound than any the old man had ever known in his workshop. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, vibrating with a new and startling truth. He looked from the transformed cello back to the young woman's tired face, and for the first time he truly saw her. He saw not a clumsy apprentice or a timid girl, but a river of knowledge flowing from a deep, ancient mountain. He had been so proud of his own little stream that he had never noticed the ocean standing right beside him. A wave of shame washed over him, hot and uncomfortable. He thought of all the times he had corrected her, all the condescending words, all the impatient sighs. He had been a fool, an arrogant old man guarding a small kingdom when she had been offering him the world. He opened his mouth to apologize, to say something, anything, to bridge the vast gap his pride had created. But the words wouldn't come. How do you apologize for a lifetime of blindness? Instead, he did something that surprised them both. He turned away from her and walked to his own workbench. He picked up his favorite carving knife, the one he had kept razor-sharp for 50 years, the one that felt like an extension of his own hand. He polished the blade with a soft cloth for a long moment, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he walked back to her and held it out, handle first. She looked at the knife, then up at him, her eyes wide with question. He didn't say anything. He just held it there, his gaze steady and clear. It was an offering, a surrender, a quiet admission that her hands now knew more than his. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. As her fingers brushed against his, he felt no spark of magic, just the simple, human warmth of her skin. But in that moment, it felt more significant than any handshake he had ever shared. "The rest of it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The cello. Show me what to do." And so the workshop began a new life. The old kingdom was gone, replaced by a shared space, a place of discovery. The young woman, now holding the old man's best knife, became the quiet leader. The first task was the front plate of the cello, the belly. The old man had a perfect symmetrical design drawn on paper, a design he had used and refined for years. He started to lay it out on the beautiful piece of spruce, his compasses in hand. "Wait," she said softly. He stopped, his hand hovering over the wood. She didn't offer a different design. Instead, she asked him to help her lift the thin plate of wood and place it across two small, felt-covered blocks on the workbench, leaving the center area free to vibrate. Then she did something that seemed utterly strange to him. She knelt down and tapped the wood gently with her knuckle. In different spots, listening intently to the sound, the old man watched, his brow furrowed in confusion. To him, it all sounded like a dull thud. But to her, it was a language. She closed her eyes, her head cocked to one side. She tapped again, a little to the left. Then again a little higher. Finally, she opened her eyes, took a pencil, and made a small dot in the very center of the plate. "That is its heart," she said simply. "Everything must grow from there, not from a measurement on a paper." From here, he was skeptical, but he was also a student now. He knelt beside her. "Show me," he asked. She took his hand and guided his knuckle to a spot on the edge of the wood. "Tap," she whispered. He did. Then she moved his hand to the spot she had marked. "Now tap here." He did. And he heard it. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was there. The second tap had a clearer, more resonant ring, a tiny bell-like tone that the other one lacked. It was as if the wood was singing a single, pure note right there, in that exact spot. The old man felt a shiver run down his spine. It was a whole new way of seeing, or rather of hearing, from that day on. He became her eager apprentice. When it came time to carve the F-holes, the elegant, swirling openings on the cello's front, he pulled out his perfectly symmetrical template. She gently pushed it aside. "The grain of the wood wants to flow," she explained. "We should follow it, not force it to be something it's not." She took the knife he had given her and, freehand, began to draw the shape on the wood. Her lines were not perfectly identical, but they had a life, a grace, a musicality that his template could never achieve. They looked like they had grown there naturally. He watched, mesmerized, and then tried it himself on the other side. His first attempt was stiff and awkward, a poor imitation of her fluid art, but she didn't correct him with harsh words. She just put her hand over his and guided him, helping him feel the flow of the grain, teaching his hands to dance again. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. He would bring her tea in the morning. They would work side by side, their silence now filled with a shared purpose. He found himself talking to her, not as a master to a student, but as one craftsman to another. He told her stories of his youth, of his own difficult master, of the first violin he ever sold. She, in turn, shared quiet stories of her grandfather, his workshop smelling of lavender and wood smoke, the way he could tell the age of a tree by the smell of its sawdust. The workshop was no longer just his sanctuary. It had become their home. The final, most sacred step was the varnish. The old man had his own secret recipe, a complex mixture of oils and resins that he had developed over decades. It gave his instruments a rich, glowing amber color. He was about to prepare it when the young woman touched his arm. "May I?" she asked. From her bag she took a small, wrapped packet. Inside was a lump of a strange, golden-colored resin. "My family adds a little of this," she said, "from the amber trees near our village. It makes the wood a little more alive." He looked at his precious, proven recipe, and then at her small, mysterious offering. It was the last piece of his old self he had to give up. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Let's try it," he said. They mixed the varnish together, his deep amber and her bright gold swirling into a new, brilliant color. As they applied the thin, gleaming coats to the finished cello, it was as if they were sealing their partnership. The instrument that emerged was breathtaking. It had the structural perfection and technical mastery of his best work, but it had something more. It had a soul, a warmth, a story that could only have come from her. It was, without a doubt, the finest thing either of them had ever created. The old man stood back and looked at it, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper. It was gratitude. He looked over at the young woman who was carefully cleaning the brushes, a contented smile on her face. He was no longer the master who had taken on a student. He was a craftsman who had been lucky enough to find a partner, a teacher who had been blessed with a master. And he knew, with a certainty that brought him nothing but peace, that his best work was not the cello resting on the bench. It was the journey that had led him to this moment, and the new harmony he had found in the quiet, shared space of his workshop. The morning the cellist was due to arrive, the workshop felt different. The air was still thick with the familiar scent of wood and resin, but there was a new energy humming beneath it, a quiet excitement. The finished cello stood on a simple stand in the center of the room, bathed in the soft light from the window. It was more than just an instrument. It was a testament to a journey. The flame maple back shimmered like captured sunlight, and the golden amber varnish they had mixed together seemed to glow from within. The old man looked at it not with the pride of a creator, but with the deep, quiet joy of a collaborator. He walked over to it and gently polished a small tuning peg with a soft cloth, not because it needed it, but just to be close to it one last time before it went out into the world. The young woman was at her bench, carefully arranging her tools. She was no longer in the corner, but at a bench of her own right next to his. Her space was orderly but lived in, with small shavings of precious wood and sketches of her own design scattered about. She looked up and caught his eye. They didn't need to speak. A small, shared smile passed between them, a smile that said everything. They had done this, together. Around noon, a long, black car pulled up outside, its sheen a stark contrast to the dusty, honest street. A tall, impeccably dressed man got out, carrying an expensive-looking case. The famous cellist had arrived. He entered the workshop with an air of confidence, his eyes immediately scanning the room, assessing, judging. He was a man who was used to the best and knew exactly what he was looking for. He nodded curtly at the old man, his gaze barely lingering before it fell upon the cello. He approached it slowly, the way a predator might approach its prey. He didn't touch it at first. He circled it, his eyes narrowed, taking in every curve, every line. He knelt down, looking at the reflection of the floor in the varnish. The old man held his breath, his hands clasped behind his back. He remembered feeling this same nervousness countless times before, but it was different now. It wasn't his own ego on the line. It was hers. He found himself desperately wanting this man to see what he now saw, to understand the magic that had happened in this room. The cellist finally reached out and tapped the wood with his knuckle, listening to the resonance. He did it again and again in different spots. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professional concentration. He ran his long, sensitive fingers along the edges of the F-holes, feeling for any imperfection. He checked the purfling, the thin strip of inlay that bordered the instrument. The young woman stood perfectly still, watching him, her own hands clasped in front of her. The old man could see the faintest tremor in them. After what felt like an eternity, the cellist stood up. "It is beautiful," he said, his voice a low baritone. The words were a compliment, but they were delivered with a certain distance, a clinical appreciation. He opened his own case and took out his bow. "But the wood tells the final story, may I?" The old man simply nodded, unable to trust his own voice. The cellist lifted the cello and sat down on a worn stool they had placed in the center of the room. He settled it between his knees, his body becoming one with the instrument. He rosined his bow with quick practiced strokes. Then there was a moment of absolute silence. The old man and the young woman stood together, like parents waiting to hear their child speak for the first time. He began to play. It started with a single, deep note. A note so rich and full it seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in the floorboards, in the walls, in their very bones. It was a sound that felt ancient and new at the same time. Then the melody began to unfold. It was a complex, passionate piece of music, full of sorrow and joy, of thundering storms and quiet, tender moments. As the cellist played, his professional mask began to crack. His eyes closed. His body swayed. He was no longer testing the cello. He was having a conversation with it. And the cello was singing back. The old man listened, and he could hear their two spirits in the music. He could hear his own precision in the clean, powerful notes, the solid foundation he had built. But woven through it, like a thread of gold, was something else. It was the young woman's intuition. It was in the way the cello could whisper one moment and roar the next, in the warmth and the vulnerability of its tone. It was the sound of the wood soul, a soul she had coaxed out into the open. He looked over at her. A single tear was tracing a path down her cheek, but she was smiling. She was hearing it. When the final note faded, it hung in the air for a long, long time before disappearing into silence. The cellist sat motionless, his bow still resting on the strings. Then he slowly opened his eyes. They were shining. He looked at the cello in his hands as if it were a holy relic. He gently placed it back on its stand and turned to the old man. "Maestro," he said, his voice filled with an emotion that went far beyond simple approval. "This is not just a beautiful instrument. It is a living, breathing thing. It is the masterpiece of your career. The voice is extraordinary." The old man felt a swell of pride, but it was a quiet, shared pride. He looked at the young woman who was trying to make herself small in the background. He knew this was his final lesson, the last thing he had to learn. He took a small step to the side, turning the cellist's attention with him. "You are right," the old man said, his voice clear and steady. "It is a masterpiece. But it was not my work alone." He gestured towards the young woman, his hand open and inviting. "This is her wood?" "Her soul. Her artistry saved it. I am proud to have been her assistant." The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with shock. The cellist turned his gaze to her, really seeing her for the first time. He saw the sawdust on her apron, the calluses on her hands, the deep, quiet wisdom in her eyes. He walked over to her and, with a deep, respectful bow, took her hand. "Then I am honored to meet the true master," he said. "Thank you for giving this music a voice." After the cellist left, promising that the world would soon know the story of this miraculous cello, the workshop settled back into its peaceful rhythm. But everything had changed. The old man felt lighter, as if a great weight he had been carrying his entire life had finally been lifted. He was no longer the guardian of a flame. He was just another person who enjoyed its warmth. A year passed. The workshop was a different place. It was noisier, messier, more alive. The young woman now had a waiting list of her own commissions for violins and violas. Her bench was covered with her own projects, instruments with a unique, vibrant character that was becoming her signature. The old man worked beside her, no longer on grand, high-pressure commissions, but on smaller things. He was restoring old, forgotten violins, bringing them back to life with a patience and joy he hadn't felt in decades. He was learning again, every day, from the quiet master who worked beside him. He would often stop what he was doing just to watch her hands move, to see the way she listened to the wood, and he would smile. One sunny afternoon, a knock came at the workshop door. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a nervous energy and a portfolio of drawings clutched under his arm. He looked around the room with wide, hopeful eyes, his gaze landing on the old man, who was carefully planing a strip of willow for a cello repair. "Excuse me," the young man said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm looking for the master luthier. I was hoping I might be able to talk to him about an apprenticeship." The old man put down his playing. He looked at the young man, and for a second he saw a ghost of the past, a reflection of the young woman who had stood in that very spot years ago, scared and full of hidden potential. A warm, genuine smile spread across his face. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his cloth, wiped the dust from his hands, and gestured with his thumb toward the young woman, who was carefully carving the scroll of a new violin, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She's right over there," the old man said, his voice filled with a calm, certain peace. "She's the one you'll want to talk to." The old man's anger was a storm that passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a quiet, hollow devastation. He walked the cold streets for hours, the city lights blurring into meaningless smears of color. He didn't see the people hurrying past or hear the traffic. All he could see was that ugly, final gash in the beautiful wood, a symbol of his own failure. It wasn't just a piece of maple he had ruined. It was his legacy. The commission was lost, his reputation was in tatters, and the masterpiece he had dreamed of his entire life was nothing more than firewood. Eventually the cold seeped into his old bones, and he found his way home, falling into a dreamless, exhausted sleep on his armchair, still fully dressed. Back in the workshop, the silence was heavy. The ruined cello back lay on the bench, a wound in the heart of the room. The single light the old man had left on cast long, distorted shadows, making the place feel like a tomb. The expensive tool he had thrown lay on the floor where it had fallen, a silent witness to his rage. An hour passed, then two. The world outside was dark and still, then a key turned softly in the lock. The door creaked open, and the young woman slipped back inside. She had not gone far. She had sat on a bench across the street, her heart aching for the old man and for the wood. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a pull, a responsibility. She couldn't leave it like that, broken and abandoned. She moved through the workshop not like an intruder, but like someone coming home. Her first instinct was to pick up the fallen tool, cleaning it carefully and placing it back in its rightful spot on the wall. Then she approached the bench. She gently ran her fingers over the deep gouge, her touch full of pity. The old man saw a catastrophic error. She saw a cry for help. In her mind she could hear the wood, not with words but with feelings. It was hurt, but it wasn't dead. It had a memory of the shape it was supposed to be, and it wanted to be whole again. She took a deep breath, and a change came over her. The hesitant, clumsy apprentice disappeared. In her place stood a craftsman, confident and sure. Her posture straightened. Her eyes, which had been so often downcast, were now sharp and focused. She looked around the workshop, not with the awe of a novice, but with the assessing gaze of an equal. She knew where everything was. She gathered a few tools the old man rarely used, a small, heated iron with a cloth-wrapped tip, a selection of tiny, delicate carving tools, and a small jar of her own, which she took from her canvas bag. What happened next was a kind of magic. She worked through the long, quiet hours of the night. The sounds she made were nothing like the harsh, aggressive noises of the old man's frustration. Her work was a symphony of soft whispers. She started with the heated iron, passing it carefully over the wood surrounding the gouge. She wasn't burning it. She was coaxing the fibers, relaxing them, making them pliable and open to change. It was a technique her grandfather had taught her, a way of asking the wood for its forgiveness before you began to heal it. Then came the carving. Her hands moved with an impossible grace. She didn't try to cut away the damaged part. Instead, she seemed to sculpt the entire area around it, blending the wound into a new, more elegant curve. It was as if she was not removing wood, but rather persuading it to move, to flow into a new form. The deep gash became the lowest point of a beautiful, subtle dip in the arching, a feature that looked like it had been designed there from the very beginning. It gave the wood a new kind of life, a story of survival and beauty. She worked with a profound concentration, her world shrinking to just her, the tool, and the wood. Sometimes she would stop, close her eyes, and hover her hands over the surface, as if listening to a whisper only she could hear. And then she would continue, her movements sure and precise. She was not following a diagram or a measurement. She was following the soul of the wood. By the time the first hint of gray dawn began to seep through the workshop window, she was finished. The cello back was not just repaired. It was transformed. The new curve was more alive, more resonant, more full of personality than the one the old man had originally designed. Exhausted, she cleaned her tools, sat down on her stool, and fell into a deep sleep, her head resting on her arms. When the old man unlocked the workshop door that morning, he felt like a man walking to his own execution. He had come not to work, but to clean up his mess. He planned to wrap the ruined wood in burlap and carry it out, a final, shameful act. He stopped dead just inside the door. His heart skipped a beat. The cello back was on the main workbench, but it was different. The light from the window hit it in a way he had never seen before, creating a shimmering, liquid glow. He walked towards it as if in a trance, his feet barely making a sound on the floor. He reached out a trembling hand, afraid to touch it, afraid it was a dream. His fingers traced the new curve. It was perfect, flawless. The skin of his fingertips, which had been reading wood for over 60 years, told him everything. The surface was smoother than silk. The arching was a work of genius. There was no sign of the gash, no patch, no repair. It was as if the wood had grown this way overnight. His eyes scanned the room, and that's when he saw her. The young woman, asleep on her stool, her head on her arms, looking completely spent. The truth crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't dreamed it. She had done this. She had done this. All his frustration, all his rigid methods, all his years of experience had led to failure. Her quiet, intuitive presence had led to this miracle. He felt a wave of something so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a mix of awe, profound shame, and a dawning, terrifying humility. He, the master, had been shown the way by the apprentice. He gently touched her shoulder. "Child," he said, his voice soft, stripped of all its old harshness. "Wake up." She stirred, lifting her head. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but when she saw his face, she sat up straight, a flicker of her old fear returning. "I'm sorry," she started to say, but he held up a hand. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't be sorry, just tell me how? How did you do this?" She looked at the shallow back, then back at him. She saw not anger in his eyes, but a desperate, genuine plea for understanding. She took a breath and decided to trust him. "My grandfather," she said quietly. "And my father." They were luthiers too, in a small village. "We didn't have many tools or fancy books. We just had the wood. He taught me that every piece has a voice. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. You don't tell it what to be. You ask it what it wants to become." The old man listened, his world unraveling and then slowly knitting itself back together in a new pattern. All the strange things he had seen her do, the measuring with her eyes closed, the intuitive fixes it all suddenly made sense. She wasn't a student trying to learn his rules. She was an artist from a different tradition, one far older and perhaps far wiser than his own. He had been so busy teaching her, he had never once stopped to realize that she had a wisdom to share.